The most famous man in America stood at the bottom of the stairs. He had just checked his son's crib. It was empty. Not empty because someone had moved him. Not empty because of a misunderstanding. Empty because someone had come through that window, climbed a homemade ladder up to the second floor, reached into that crib, and taken his 20-month-old baby boy into the cold March night. Charles Lindbergh stood there for a moment. Just stood there. 5 years earlier, 1 million people had lined the streets of New York to scream his name. He had shaken hands with kings. He had been called the greatest man alive. Every newspaper in the world had put his face on the front page. And right now, none of it meant a single thing. There was a note on the windowsill. $50,000. Or they would never see the boy again. Charles Lindbergh, the man who had conquered the Atlantic Ocean alone, picked up that note. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. But to understand how a man gets to that moment, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a boy who had nothing, who wanted only one thing, and who chased it so hard, he accidentally became the most famous human being on earth. Charles Lindbergh grew up quiet, not shy, just alone. His father was a congressman who was never home. His mother was a science teacher who believed that feelings were meant to be controlled, not shown. They separated when Charles was young, and nobody talked about it. So he learned to be self-sufficient early. He fixed things. He figured things out on his own. He went days without real conversation and didn't seem to mind. What he did mind was being ordinary. The first time he saw an airplane, he was a teenager at a county fair in Minnesota. The pilot did loops and dives over the crowd. Everyone around him screamed and laughed. Charles just stared. He didn't scream. He didn't laugh. He just watched that machine move through the air and made up his mind right there in that field. That was going to be him. He dropped out of engineering school to learn to fly. He became a barnstormer, one of those daring young men who flew from town to town, did stunts for money, and slept wherever they landed. It was dangerous, poorly paid, and completely thrilling. Then he became an airmail pilot, flying sacks of letters through fog and ice and darkness, from St. Louis to Chicago, in open cockpits with no instruments worth trusting. He crashed 4 times. He survived all 4. Once he parachuted out of a plane at night and landed in a cornfield, then hitched a ride back to town. He was 23 years old. He had no money, no connections, and no famous name. Then he saw a prize, $25,000. For the first man to fly non-stop from New York to Paris. Most people said it was impossible. 6 men had already died trying. Charles Lindbergh read that and thought, that's exactly the kind of impossible I'm looking for. Nobody wanted to back him. He went to investors in New York. They laughed. He was a nobody from the Midwest, with no famous name and no record of anything serious. Why would they give him money to die over the Atlantic? He went to St. Louis, found a small group of businessmen who believed in him, not because they thought he'd win, but because they believed he'd try harder than anyone else. They gave him enough money to build a plane. He worked with a small aircraft company in San Diego called Ryan Airlines. They had 9 weeks to build a plane that had never been built before. They worked 7 days a week. Lindbergh slept in the hangar. The plane had 1 engine, 1 seat, and a fuel tank so large it sat directly in front of the cockpit, which meant he couldn't see forward at all. He had to look out the side windows or use a small periscope to see where he was going. People thought that was insane. He thought it was fine. He was 25 years old. May 20th, 1927. Roosevelt Field, Long Island. 7:52 in the morning. The runway was soft from rain. The plane was heavier than it had ever been, loaded with 450 gallons of fuel. Some of the men watching didn't think it was going to get off the ground. It cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway by about 20 feet. The crowd exhaled. Charles Lindbergh pointed the nose northeast and disappeared into the clouds. What happened over the next 33.5 hours is one of the most astonishing things any human being has ever done alone. He flew through fog so thick he couldn't see his own wingtips. Ice formed on the wings. He dropped low over the ocean to find warmer air, close enough to see the whitecaps below him, and he fought sleep every single hour. He hadn't slept the night before takeoff. He'd been too anxious. By hour 20, he was hallucinating. He later wrote that ghostly figures appeared beside him in the cockpit, talking to him, keeping him company. He wasn't sure if he was losing his mind. He kept flying. After 28 hours, he saw the coast of Ireland below him. Fishermen in small boats looked up at the sound of an engine coming from the sky. He was on course, exactly where he was supposed to be. At 10:22 p.m. Paris time, he landed at Le Bourget Airport. A crowd of 100,000 people had been waiting for hours. When they heard the engine, they broke through every barrier and rushed across the field. They reached the plane before it had even stopped rolling. He had been alone for 33.5 hours, and now he couldn't move for the bodies pressing around him. Someone grabbed his helmet and put it on their own head, pretending to be him so the crowd would follow and give Lindbergh a chance to breathe. He stood there in the dark, surrounded by 100,000 strangers, and thought, what happens now? He had no idea. Nobody ever does when the thing they dreamed of finally arrives. But here is the question nobody asked that night. Here is the thing every biography quietly skips over. What does fame like that actually cost? Stick with me, because the answer is something nobody should ever have to learn the way he did. New York gave him a parade that had never been matched before. 1,800 tons of paper fell from the buildings above Fifth Avenue. 1,800 tons. 4 million people lined the streets. The noise was so loud, people standing next to each other had to shout to be heard. Charles Lindbergh sat in that open car and smiled and waved. But the people who were close to him noticed something. He wasn't exactly thrilled. He was performing, being what they needed him to be. The truth is, what Lindbergh had loved was flying. The silence of it, the focus of it. A problem with only one right answer. The Atlantic hadn't frightened him. It had made sense to him. All of this noise and paper and screaming, made no sense to him at all. He went on a 48-state tour of America. He flew to every single state in a 3-month trip organized by the government. He shook thousands of hands, gave hundreds of speeches, smiled in 10,000 photographs. He was only 25 years old. Fame at that scale doesn't make you bigger. It makes you smaller. It puts you in a box and labels the box, and after a while, the box is all anyone can see. Then he met Anne Morrow. She was the daughter of the American ambassador to Mexico, smart, calm, and completely unimpressed by his fame, which is exactly what he needed. She became his student. He taught her to fly. Then he taught her to navigate. Eventually, she flew beside him on long expeditions, mapping air routes across the world. They flew together to Greenland, to Alaska, across Siberia, down to Japan and China. She became one of the most accomplished aviators and writers of her generation, and they were genuinely, quietly in love. In 1930, their first son was born. They named him Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. For a brief time, everything was exactly right. And then came March 1st, 1932. The window was open, the curtain moved softly in the cold air, and the crib was empty. The kidnapping became the most covered crime in American history. Newspapers called it the crime of the century. 200 investigators descended on New Jersey. 50,000 tips flooded in. A retired schoolteacher named John Condon volunteered to be a go-between and actually met with the kidnapper twice in a Bronx cemetery, handing over the ransom money in the dark. $50,000 was paid. The baby was never returned. 72 days after the kidnapping, a truck driver found the boy's body in the woods, less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh home. He had been killed the very night he was taken. The ransom had been paid for nothing. Charles Lindbergh did not break down in public. He was not built that way. He was built to hold things in. But the man who came out the other side of that year was not the same man who had flown into Le Bourget Airport 5 years before. Something had changed in him. Something cold had moved in and never left. Bruno Hauptmann was arrested in 1934, tried, convicted, and executed in 1936. Most people believed justice had been done. Charles Lindbergh was not most people. He had sat through every day of that trial. He had watched the circus of it, the reporters, the cameras, the public hunger for the story, and he was disgusted, not just by the crime, by all of it, by what fame had made his family into. A target, a story, a source of entertainment for people who had never once cared about his son as a real child. He packed up his family and moved to Europe. He told nobody where they were going. He just left. In Europe, he was given unusual access. He was invited to inspect the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, by the Nazi government. He went, thinking he was gathering information about German military strength, information that the American government quietly wanted. He was impressed by what he saw. Too impressed, he told people, publicly, that Germany's air power was so overwhelming that going to war with them would be suicide for Europe. Then he accepted a medal from Hermann Goering, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime. He accepted it in 1938. He didn't give it back. When he came back to America, he became the face of the America First movement, the campaign to keep the United States out of World War II. He gave speeches saying that the people pushing America into war were Britain, the Roosevelt administration, and Jewish people with personal interests. Roosevelt called him a defeatist and a coward. Lindbergh resigned his military commission in protest. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and everything he had said looked not just wrong, but shameful. He tried to rejoin the military. Roosevelt refused. He spent the war flying as a civilian consultant in the Pacific, technically an observer, but he flew 50 combat missions anyway. He shot down a Japanese plane. He taught American pilots how to extend their fuel range. He never publicly apologized for what he had said. He spent his later years as an environmentalist and conservationist. He flew to Africa to help protect endangered species. He wrote a memoir that won the Pulitzer Prize. He grew quieter and simpler as he aged, as if trying to get back to what he had been before the world turned him into a symbol. He died in 1974 in Maui, Hawaii, at the age of 72. But here is the last thing. After he died, it came out that Charles Lindbergh, the man who had crossed the ocean alone, had been living a secret life in Europe for decades. 3 separate relationships, 7 children, hidden from each other, hidden from Anne, hidden from everyone. His wife Anne never knew. She had written some of the most beloved books in America about love and marriage and what it means to truly know another person. She didn't know. Charles Lindbergh was a genuinely extraordinary man, and a genuinely flawed one. He was brave in ways most people never get the chance to be, and he was cold and hidden in ways that hurt the people closest to him. The fame he earned at 25 years old changed him. It protected him from consequences for decades. It gave him a platform he didn't always use well. And it built walls around him that no one, not even the people who loved him, ever fully got through. The ocean he crossed alone is still there, unchanged. It doesn't care what he became after he landed. Maybe that's the lesson. The achievement is real. It always will be. But the person who does the achieving is still human, still capable of courage and cowardice in the same lifetime, still capable of crossing an ocean and never quite finding what they were looking for on the other side. History remembers the headlines. We try to find the person underneath them. If Lindbergh's story stayed with you, if there's a moment in this that you'll still be thinking about tomorrow, that's exactly what Life Graphy is here for. Every week, we find one real life, one real story, the kind that history books mention in a single paragraph and then move on from. We don't move on. Subscribe if you want to come back. Hit the bell so you never miss one. And tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The empty crib, the secret families, the wife who never knew. Tell us below. Next week, a name you already know, a story you absolutely do not. We'll see you then.